So the place we're going next in this course is thinking about how how do firms compete? So we've talked about monopoly, right? Where there's essentially no competition, right? Firms are just pricing off of a market demand curve and not thinking at all about what other firms will do, right? And we've had perfect competition, right? Where firms don't really think about what other firms will do. They just think about, what is the market price and optimize from there. But these are both extreme examples, and what I want to do is like get us to situations that are not as extreme. So situations where more like real life, where we see just a handful of firms competing, right? But then, right, we have to worry about firms making strategic decisions or firms basically taking into account the actions that other firms will make. Okay, so like for example, we're going to talk about like Chick-fil-A competing with Zaxby, just two downtown fried chicken places, and we're going to think about like what price should they set, right, or what quantity of chicken should they produce, and that's going to depend on what the other firm does, right? So if like Zaxby decided that they weren't going to produce any chicken, right, then that's going to change how much Chick-fil-A might produce. Or if Zaxby decides they're going to set a very low price, that's going to change how Chick-fil-A might think about pricing. Okay, and so we're going to do this in the context of game theory. So a game describes a situation where players make strategic decisions taking into account the actions and reactions of other players. Right, and this is going to allow us to take into account, this situation with Zaxby and Chick-fil-A, where we think about, or where they're thinking about, what the other firm is going to do before making their decision. But then, of course, right, if Zaxby thinks Chick-fil-A is going to set a low price, maybe Zaxby will set a low price. But then, if Zaxby set a low price, then that's going to, force Chick-fil-A to respond, and so on and so forth. And so we're going to need to think about a game for handling that. Yeah, so that's, I guess, one reason to do game theory. The other reason, I just want to give a little bit of context for this, given that there's a full semester class in this. It's something that you might think about taking. I think a lot of people enjoy the lecture and might enjoy that class. All right, so for this section, I just have some notation that I want to go through pretty briefly. So we're going to be working with something called a normal form game. And that is a game where each player chooses a plan of action, or basically what moves they'll make all at the same time. So in the context of like our Zaxby and Chick-fil-A example, right, the idea is they're choosing their price at the same time, or I guess more specifically, not knowing, what the other firm is going to do yet. Okay. Our normal form games are going to, normal form games consist of basically 3 components. So 1, a finite set of players. Right. 2, a set of strategies for each player. So these are like the actions that they can take. And then finally, payoffs for each possible combination of actions. All right, and if we have a normal form game with just 2 players, we can represent that in a matrix form. So you're going to see a lot of these matrices going forward, but we're going to have, say, player 2 and player 1. And then they're going to have, at least in this example, player 2 can play basically left or right, and player 1 can play top or bottom. All right, and in that format, what we're going to do is describe the payoffs in this using a matrix like this, which has 2 inputs to each cell. And just by convention, the first cell is always going to be player 1's payoff, and the second is always going to be player 2's payoff. All right, so we have 3 components to a normal form game. First, a finite set of n players. In this case, player 1, player 2. All right. A set of strategies for each player. Well, player 1 can play either top or bottom. Player 2 can play either left or right. And then payoffs for each possible combination of actions. Well, in this case, let's say top left gets played. Well, then player 1 gets 1 unit of payoff, and player 2 gets 2. Right? If bottom left gets played, player 1 gets 2, player 2 gets 1. Right? If top right gets played, player 1 gets 0, player 2 gets 1. Right? It's always, the first is always player 1, second is always player 2. Okay. So we can see here, right, that each player's payoff, depends not only on their own strategy, right? So player 1's payoff, depends on whether or not they choose top or bottom, but also whether or not player 2 chooses left or right. So it also depends on the other player's actions, and hence this is a game. Okay. Um, so for now, there are two types of strategies that we're going to think about. Or actually, there's one type of strategy we're going to think about, which is called a pure strategy. Where a player takes a specific action and sticks to it. All right, so that might mean like player one always plays top, right? Or player one decides to play bottom. There's also a concept of a mixed strategy, right? Sometimes like it's better to play randomly, and there you might like choose that, you know, half the time I'm going to do this and half the time I'm going to do that, right? So if you're playing, I think the example that I gave in the end of the lecture is rock paper scissors, right? And in rock paper scissors, you don't like always want to play rock, right? You want to randomize a bit and play some rock, some paper, some scissors. If you were to always play rock, your opponent would sort of figure this out if you played enough times, and therefore it wouldn't be a very good strategy. So we also think about mixed strategies sometimes. But for this lecture and what we're going to do in this class, I'm just going to focus on pure strategies. I think I left the material on mixed strategies in the notes, but you won't be required to know anything about mixed strategies. All right, so one goal of game theory is to predict, you know, the types of outcomes that will occur, right? So, you know, we might think like if you're the mayor of Athens and you're trying to decide whether or not to let Chick-fil-A enter on the corner of College and Broad, right? You might worry about, well, what is that going to do to the price that, you know, Zaxby gets, or is Zaxby still going to be profitable? And so what you would want is you would want to predict the outcome of, you know, what's going to happen when these firms compete, okay? And so the way that we're going to find these predictions is we're going to look for equilibrium concepts, right? Which we might think are like reasonable outcomes that might, where sort of outcomes of these games. So we're going to have three equilibrium concepts that we're going to discuss in this class. The first being dominant strategies. The second being something called iterated elimination of dominated strategies. And then finally, the very famous Nash equilibrium. All right, and so the idea is these are all going to give us, you know, some reasonable criteria for predictions of, you know, what might happen when these firms compete. But they have different strengths and weaknesses. So dominant strategies, right? You know, if they often don't exist. But if they do exist, and I'll talk more about this as we cover them, we feel pretty confident that, you know, this will be the outcome. I should say, an equilibrium in, we feel pretty confident an equilibrium in dominant strategies will be the outcome. All right. Iterated elimination of dominated strategies is sort of the opposite here. They're very common, right, but may not provide very precise predictions. And again, I'll talk about that as we go. But I just want to sort of give the punchline first. And then finally, we'll talk about Nash equilibria. And there's sort of in between. So Nash equilibrium here is sort of a, so Nash equilibrium will always exist, at least in mixed strategies. For a normal form game, I should say. So this is better in some sense than a dominant strategy, but are much more precise than iterated elimination of dominated strategies, which I'm going to call IEDS, just to not have to write so much. So we're just going to go through and talk about these three in the next three different equilibrium concepts in the next three lectures. All right, so I'm going to talk about equilibria and dominant strategies in this video. The first thing though, before we talk about that, I want to define a best response. So we say that a strategy is a best response if it is a strategy with the highest payoff for a given move that another player makes. So basically it's the best response to one thing that another player does. I find it helpful to just underline best responses in basically all of the games that we play or that we're going to work with, just to start off with. So to give an example of this, I'm going to use the same matrix that I did in the previous video. So you already have this in your notes if you've been sort of watching as we go. All right, and recall that the first point here is player one's payoff, or the first entry into each matrix, and the second is player two's payoff. So if we want to get, say that the other move is like player two playing left. So player two is going to play left. All right, what is player one's best response? Should they play top or bottom? Right, well, what is the highest payoff? Right, if player two plays left, right, what's the highest payoff for that given move? Right, well, it's to play bottom, right, because playing top gets player one, who gets the first term, they get 1. Playing bottom, player 1 gets 2, right? And so if player 2 plays left, player 1 should play bottom. That's their best response, right? If player 2 plays right, what is player 1's best response? Should they play top or bottom? So I'm going to just pause for a second to let you think about it. And then the answer here is that they should play bottom, right? Because the player, they would get one if they, sorry, they get 0 if they play top, they get 1 if they play bottom. That's the highest payoff for this given move that player 2 made. For player 2, let's suppose that the move that player 1 made is to play top. What's player 2's best response? Should they play left or should they play right? So if they play left, they get 2. If they play right, they get 1, because we look at the second term here for player 2. And so player 2's best response is to play left, right? If player 1 plays top, is player 2's best response to play left or right? Sorry, if player 1 plays bottom, is player 2's best response to play left or right? So if they play left, player 2 gets 1. If they play right, player 2 gets 0. Right? So player 2's best response is to play left if player 1 plays bottom. Okay. So that's the idea of a best response. Now, we're going to say that a dominant strategy is a strategy which is optimal regardless of the player, what other players do. All right, so a dominant strategy is a strategy which is optimal regardless of what other players do. All right, and in terms of this, right, or in terms of how to think about this, the way that I sort of like to explain that, right, is we have a dominant strategy if it is always if a particular choice or action is always underlined. All right, so in this example, right, for player 1, right, bottom is always underlined, right? It is always better to play bottom than top, right? So regardless of what player 2 does, right? So if player 2 plays left, bottom is better for player 1. If player 2 plays right, bottom is better for player 1, right? So bottom is a dominant strategy for player 1 because its best response is always to play bottom, regardless of what player 2 does, right? Does player 2 have a best response? So just to reiterate here, B is the best response for player 1 because B is better than T, regardless of what player 2 does. All right. Does player 2 have a best response? And the answer here, yes, right? So left, right, is always better than right. Right? So if player 1 plays top, left is better than right. If player 1 plays bottom, left is better than right. right? Left is always underlined, it's always the best response, so this is a dominant strategy. All right, so if a player has a dominant strategy, right, we feel pretty confident that they'll use it because it always makes sense to use, right? It's always the best thing that they could do, right? So we think that they should do this, right? And it doesn't really matter what they're thinking about, like what other players are going to do. It always makes sense to do this, so why shouldn't they do it? And so yeah, we normally think, this will, the players will play dominant strategies. And if each player has a dominant strategy, then we feel pretty confident that that will be the outcome of the game. And we'll call that an equilibrium in dominant strategies. All right, so each player, right, has, in this game, right, each player has a dominant strategy, right? Player 1 should always play bottom, player 2 should always play left, right? And so we have here, right, an equilibrium in dominant strategies, right, neither, which is bottom left. So sorry about the page length here. So in our example, BL is an equilibrium in dominant strategies. Right, both players, right, for player 1, they always want to play bottom regardless of what player 2 does, right? Player 2 always wants to play left. Neither player has any incentive to change their behavior, right? And so that's why this is an equilibrium. The advantage of an equilibrium in dominant strategies is we're pretty confident that they'll exist if they exist. That we're pretty confident that players will play them if they exist. The issue is that they don't always exist, which is a problem because then we don't have a prediction at all, right? So let me just give an example of that. Example of non-existence. All right, so let's say the way that this works is that Chick-fil-A and Zaxby are each setting prices, and all of the demand goes to the firm that has a lower price, okay? So let's say that for now, Chick-fil-A is charging $10, all right? What should Zaxby do, right? Well, Zaxby's best response is going to be to set its price at 1 cent less. So Zaxby's best response, right, will be to set a price of $9.99, right? But then Chick-fil-A's best response to that, right, would be to set a price of $9.98, right? And so in this case, and we want to be like really careful about sort of the definition and the rules here, but in this case, right, there is no best response because no matter what the other firm does, sorry, there's no dominant strategy because no matter what the other firm does, the best response is always to play like 1 cent below what the other firm does. And so like 998 can't be a dominant strategy because the other firm would just price at 997 and then 996 would be the best response. So this is a case where there's no equilibrium in dominant strategies. We will see that there's a Nash equilibrium of this pricing game. So I'm going to talk about iterated elimination of dominated strategies. And we'll go through this table, which is table 2 in the notes. There are going to be 2 takeaways from going through this table. So first, this table has no dominant strategies. All right, which means that prediction concept of equilibrium and dominant strategies that we thought of last time doesn't work. It doesn't really give us any prediction. And then we'll show that there is a prediction with iterated elimination of dominated strategies. IEDS is how I'm going to call this. So let's start by doing what I said we should always start with, which is let's figure out what the best responses are for each player. So let's suppose for a second that player 1 plays left. Sorry, player 2 plays left. What should player 1 do? Top, middle, or bottom? So player 1 should play top. Right, now let's suppose player 2 plays right. What should player 1 do? Right, they should play bottom. All right, so for player 2, what if player 1 plays top? What should player 2 do? They should play right. If player 1 plays middle, what should player 2 do? They should play left. And if player 1 plays bottom, what should player 2 do? They should play right. Okay. So first, right, and I do want to stress actually that the definitions here are, and like there's a lot of precision in the wording, and you sort of want to just follow the rules very specifically. In terms of, what does it mean to be a dominant strategy? What does it mean to be a dominated strategy? Like these things like really matter. But in terms of a dominant strategy, and I'm doing sort of air quotes, a dominant strategy, we see that neither firm or neither player has a dominant strategy, right? Because you never see, right, that, for player 2, you never see that everything is underlined for them. Right, same with player 1. You never see that top is always underlined, or middle is always underlined, or bottom is underlined. For player 2, you never see that right is always underlined or left is always underlined. Right, so there are no dominant strategy in this game, so there's no prediction here. But like that's a really strong way to think about what might this other player do. Right, because that requires, regardless of what the other player does, it never, it always makes sense for me to play this, or it always makes sense for me to play that, and that's just like a little bit too strong. It could be, we think that it, in this case, so long as I think the other player is going to do this, right, would it ever make sense for me to play, top, right? It might be a better way to sort of think about what is a reasonable thing to play. Okay, so the way that we're going to sort of formalize that is, let me define basically what it means to be dominated. So, and I'm going to use the strictly dominated terminology here, but a strategy is strictly dominated if there is at least one other strategy which has strictly higher payoffs for every possible strategy other players could play. All right, and so what this means, right, or what sort of thinking about what a dominated strategy means, is you could never basically rationalize, this, playing something dominated, because there's always something that's as good or better. All right, so if we look at our example in this table, right, what we're looking for, right, is, and these are sort of, these take a little work because you have to kind of compare each strategy, right, is we're looking for something where like there's always something that's better, right, or just as good. All right, so like let's look at player one, right? And let's start by comparing bottom to middle, right? We see that player one, if player two plays left, bottom is always better than middle. If player two plays right, for player one, bottom is always better than middle. So bottom strictly dominates middle. Okay, or M is strictly dominated by B. Okay, if we compare top to middle, right, we see that when player two plays left, right, top is strictly better than middle. And if player two plays right, top is just the same as middle. All right, so M is weakly dominated by T. Okay, so the idea here, right, is for thinking about, predicting outcomes, right, we feel pretty confident that players won't play dominated strategies. Right, so if you were playing this game, right, with a friend, let's say, and your friend played M, right? That would be super weird because they could always do better by playing B, right? There's no way that they can rationalize, and I'm again quotes here, playing M, right? There's no way that they can justify doing that. B is always better, right? And so we don't think that they should play M, and so like that would just be a weird thing for them to do. So we feel confident that players won't play their dominated strategies, okay? But once we've done that, right, or once we've sort of made this logical step, right, well then if they're not going to play M, right, why should player 2 expect them to play M, right? And if that's the case, well, let's just take M off the board, okay? Now that sort of changes the calculus for player 2, because if player 1 was to play bottom, right? If player 1 was to play middle, if player 1 was to play middle, player 2 should play left, right? Now left doesn't make any sense. Regardless of what player 1 does, right, top or bottom, now player 2 wants to play right, right? And so getting rid of middle, or player 2 knowing that player 1 should never play middle, right, changes the game for player 2, and now player 2 sees that left is strictly dominated by right, right? It is always better for player 2 to play right than left. And that wasn't true before we took out M, but there's no reason for player 1 to play M, and so we can sort of iterate through, right? And so once we remove M, right, L is strictly dominated by R. Okay, and so what we can do, and I don't have a good way, let me see if sort of folding this up is going to get me a little bit more board space here. Right, so what we can do then is we can get rid of L for player 1. Yeah, I know I'm high tech here. Get rid of L for player 2, right? And then, right, at that point we know that, so player 1 can still play top or bottom, right? And we know that bottom at that point, well, player 2 is gonna play right, so bottom strictly dominates top, or top is strictly dominated by bottom. And so we know that the equilibrium of this game, right, is bottom right. So the equilibrium by iterated elimination of dominated strategies is BR, bottom right. And just recall, right, that before there were no dominant strategies. We didn't have an equilibrium in dominant strategies, or actually dominant strategies at all. But using this method and just the logical idea that players should never play a dominated strategy, it would never make sense to play something that is always worse than something else, right? We can get some traction, and in this case, right, we can get a prediction, okay? So in terms of okay, so let me just so I'm going to go back then, and let me sort of just talk through sort of how we do iterated elimination of dominated strategies. And this is just sort of a formulaic recipe And it's in the notes, and it's really what we just did. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about basically what it means to be rationalizable, and sort of why we would or wouldn't want to use iterated elimination of dominated strategies. So in terms of the recipe here, right, what did we just do, right? Well, basically what you want to do is go through and just first, cross out all the dominated strategies for player 1, right? And then cross out all the dominated strategies for player 2, and then just keep repeating until you can't cross anything out anymore. All right, and so, we did this, so I'm going to flip the page really quick, so if you want to pause and write, go for it. Right, so first, right, we crossed out M for player 1, or for player 1, and then we crossed out L for player 2, and then we crossed out top for player 1. And then we were done. We had just one prediction. All right. So this is how we generally solve these games. And so then once we've done that and we've solved this game, right? We're left with basically a set of strategies called rationalizable strategies. So a rationalizable strategy is any pure strategy which is not strictly dominated. All right, and what I mean by that, right, I mean, this actually comes pretty close to the sort of English or layperson's definition of rationalizable, right? Like, you could always rationalize that you would want to play something, right, because it's not strictly dominated. So there could be like a case where, you could rationalize it by saying it basically that it's not strictly dominated, meaning that there's always a case, or there's a case that makes sense to play that thing, right? So being strictly dominated means that it's never the case that this is the best thing to play. There's always something better, right? Or there's another option that's always better. But like, if that's not true, then that means that there's one option that is worse, right? Or there's one option where like playing the thing that you want to play that's rationalizable is better than something else, right? Because it's not strictly dominated. Right, and so you could always say, oh, well, I can rationalize this because, playing, I thought the other player was going to play A, and so I played X, right? And so that seems like a reasonable way to go, right? There's always a logic, right, to what these players play, and so that seems like a reasonable definition or way to predict. Let's just take all of the things where at least we can logically make a guess that they'll play that, right? The problem is this doesn't always narrow down the game very much, okay? All right, so I'm going to come back to this pricing example, right? And this is one of those places where like the distinction in the terms here really matters. And like in general in game theory, like the precision in the terms is pretty important in terms of how we define these things and what they mean. But let's think about, let's say that, Zaxby charges $330 for their, bucket of chicken fingers. All right, so before we showed that this couldn't be a dominant strategy, right? Because Chick-fil-A could just play 329. Okay, it is also not strictly dominated. Right? Zaxby can rationalize playing 330. If Chick-fil-A sets a price of 331 or 332 or 333, right? And so if you were to go to the store, right, and like talk to the manager and be like, why did you set the price at 330, right? He could always just say, well, I thought Chick-fil-A was going to set a price of 331 or 332. And that's why I set 330, right? And so if you see a world in which Chick-fil-A is setting a price of 329 and Zaxby's setting a price of 330, right? Like Zaxby's probably made a mistake in that world where demand is all going to go to Chick-fil-A, but there's a rationalization for it. And so in that sense, right, it's not strictly dominated, it's rationalized. Right, but we could think about that at any price, right? If I said, "Why are you charging $9.90?" You could say, "Well, I thought Chick-fil-A was going to charge $9.91." Or if we said, Zaxby set a price of $100, the manager could say, I thought it would be $101 that Chick-fil-A would charge, right? So the problem in this case. Right? Everything is rationalizable. Right? So iterated elimination of dominated strategies, right, doesn't really narrow down our prediction at all. Right, so I'm going to talk about Nash equilibrium now, and just to review, right, the issue with dominant strategies was that everything needs to be optimal under all, a choice needs to be optimal, or a strategy needs to be optimal under all circumstances. Right, and this can be rare. For iterated elimination of dominated strategies, right, here the issue is that often, a strategy isn't, or often too many strategies are rationalizable. right? And so we can come back and sort of think more carefully about, well, what do we really need as like a minimum way to sort of think about how we should predict how players are going to play, right? And one way to do that is just, well, let's just assume that everyone is acting in, maximizing their utility. All right, and if that's the case, right, then if a player is maximizing their utility under a certain set of choices, right, then we think, okay, well, that's pretty likely that they're going to, that this is a good choice for them. And if we could find situations where all players were simultaneously maximizing their utility, right, then we would think that this is sort of a stable outcome, right, because no one wants to deviate from that strategy, right, because they're all doing the best they can. So if all players are simultaneously maximizing their utility at a given outcome, right, then this outcome is strategically stable, right? Meaning no one wants to deviate from their strategy. All right. And so understanding, right, that this is, just let's have players maximize utility, and if they're all maximizing their utility at the same time, then that's a stable outcome. That's essentially what the idea of a Nash equilibrium is. All right. So a Nash equilibrium is a strategy profile such that each player's choice is optimal given every other player's choice. All right, and I think at least the way that I sort of think about a Nash equilibrium, right, or sort of in my head, the way that I think about this is each player is playing a best response to all the other players' best responses. All right, or they're simultaneously all playing best responses. And so to give an example here, right, so if there were like 3 players, right, that means that each one is playing the best response to the other 2 players' best responses, or they're playing the best response to what the other two will do, but that's true for all three. So they're all three playing a best response to each other. And this is, I guess, a nice feature because it seems like this should be sort of the minimum that you need in order to get a rational prediction, right? Because if each player wasn't, if one player wasn't playing a best response, right, then you'd think you wouldn't have that stable of an outcome, right? Because they would want to deviate. They would want to do something else because they're not playing their best response to somebody else's move. So in order to find a best response or a Nash equilibrium, right, what we want to do is we want to look for situations, right, where both of the like player one and player two's strategies are underlined. I'm going to call these look for sort of outcomes. All right, so I'm going to bring back this game that we had earlier when we were looking at dominant strategies. Okay, and the game at the beginning of the lecture. Right, and here with this game, right, we see that for bottom left, right, player one is playing a best response to player two. Playing bottom is player one's best response to player two playing left. Player two playing left is a best response to player one playing bottom, right? And so this is a best response. Each player is playing a best response to the other player's best response, right? And therefore we have a Nash equilibrium here at bottom left, right? Both players are playing a best response to the other player's best response, right? How is this different than a dominant strategy, right? Because we showed that this was, bottom left was also an equilibrium in dominant strategies, right? A dominant strategy equilibrium means that both, for player one, right, bottom has to be underlined for both, and for player two, left had to be underlined for both, right? For a Nash equilibrium, we just need this square to be underlined for both player one and player two, but we don't need like the other off equilibrium outcomes to be also best responses, right? So to sort of summarize that, a Nash equilibrium, and Nash equilibrium NNE, differs from an equilibrium in dominant strategies which required the strategy to be a best response to all possible actions the other player could take. here is the, the underlined word, to all right, so it needed to be, it needed to be a best response. Bottom, to be a dominant strategy, needed to be a best response to both left and right, right? The Nash equilibrium concept only requires that each player is playing a best response to the other's best response. So we don't have to worry about what's happening in these other squares. To give an example where these don't line up, let's consider the following game, right? So player 2, player 1, left, right, top, bottom, right? And here we have like 1, 1, 0, 0, 0, 0, 1, 1. All right. So the first thing we should do, right, when looking for either a Nash equilibrium or a dominant strategy, is let's underline the best responses. So if player 2 plays left, player 1 should play, in this case, top. If player 2 plays right, player 1 should play bottom. All right, if player 1 plays top, player 2 should play left. If player 1 plays bottom, player 2 should play right. And so here we have 2 Nash equilibria and no dominant strategies. Right, no dominant strategies because, like for player 1, bottom is not a dominant strategy because if player 2 plays left, right, then bottom is not the best response, right? But in this case, right, we can have a Nash equilibria that includes bottom because if player 2 plays right, they're playing a best response to each other's best responses. So hopefully that makes the distinction clear. I spend a lot of time on this. Because game theory is one of those disciplines where like precision and sort of terminology really matters. And I think a lot of players or a lot of students, the mistake that they make is that they think of game theory as being something very intuitive, or like, I'm going to try to figure out who's going to win or like what the best outcome is. And it's not that. It's really, you just want to follow the rules very carefully and follow the definitions to figure out how the game is being given sort of the way that we think about the equilibriums that we're assuming are going to be played, right? Then what are the outcomes, right? And so you want to think very carefully about the definitions of those equilibriums to see if they exist and what they are, rather than trying to kind of just eyeball your way through this. So we'll see in the next video lecture an example where actually we have sort of bad equilibria or equilibria that are not, no one would choose these if they could kind of get together and make a choice, which I think sort of breaks the intuition that, we should have good outcomes from games, or, I don't know, students are always very confused with, or I always have a number of students. All right, so in this video, I'm gonna talk about a prisoner's dilemma. And it's both, I guess, a really famous example from game theory. So one that it's probably good to know as an undergraduate, econ major, but also one that I think really makes clear the point that you really have to follow the rules when working with these games. Like, it's hard to look at these and just kind of say this is the best outcome. That's not what we're doing here. We're looking for equilibria, which have very particular rules to how we solve them or how we find them. And the reason I say that is because a prisoner's dilemma is a situation, right? And really the thing that I want you to take away from this lecture is just the definition of a prisoner's dilemma. And it's a situation where players acting in their own best interests produce suboptimal outcomes, okay? So, I guess we sort of think of economics or, like this theory of like perfect competition or Adam Smith or whatever, everyone operating in their own best interest leads to, these great outcomes of perfect competition and the market is great, right? And this is an example where that's not necessarily true, right? We can have situations where everyone operating in their own best interest actually leads to outcomes that are quite bad for all of the participants. So I'm going to do this in sort of I'm going to do this twice with two different examples. The first one is a little bit contrived, but it's an example that I think you'll relate to, which is studying for the midterm or studying for a final or something, or for an exam in a class like mine, which is curved. Okay, so example, studying for final. And these are different examples than or what is in the notes, which is sort of the classic prisoner's dilemma case. I don't think that one is very relatable, so I teach it differently. Okay, so let's just to give you a sense, let's say, as my syllabus does, that I'm going to curve to an 80 mean. So we have an exam, it's out of 100, curve to an 80 mean, and just because studying is kind of a bummer, right, the cost of studying is 10. Okay, like, you'd probably rather be hanging out with your friends, or, it's sort of weird to do this in the middle of a stay-at-home order, right? But like, maybe you'd rather be playing video games or baking or something than studying. So there's some mental cost of studying. If you study, you get an 80. If you don't study, all right, you get a 40. All right, so let's draw out the payoffs to this game. And let's just say, for the sake of it, that there are only two people playing. All right, so there's going to be you and your friend. Okay. And so let's say both you and your friend study. Sorry, hold on. You and your friend both study. All right, in that case, you both get 80s, right? We're going to curve to an 80, so the curved grade for both of you is an 80, but because there's a cost to studying, you both get a final payoff of 70. Grades of 80, but then a 70 because you had to spend the time studying. Let's say you both don't study, okay? So you both get 40s. Right? I'm going to curve it to an 80, so you both wind up with a curved score of an 80, and you didn't study, so you both basically get 80 points. All right, now let's say you study and your friend doesn't, right? In that case, right, the mean is a 60, so you get 20 extra points, right, because I curve it up to an 80 from a 60. So you get 100 minus 10 for studying. So you get 90, and your friend, right, got a 40, but 20 extra points, which is a 60. and because they didn't study, they don't lose the 10. And same way, if your friend studies and you don't, they get a 90 and you get a 60 at the end of the day, right? Or they get an 80, but 20 points for the curve and then minus 10 for studying. You get a 40 and then 20 points for the curve. So we have a game that looks like this, right? Now, let's go through and just find the best responses, right? What is the best response for each player? So suppose that your friend isn't, suppose that your friend isn't going to study. Okay, what should you do? Right? Should you study or should you not study? Right? And the answer is you should study. Suppose that your friend isn't going to study. Should you study or not study? Right? And again, you want to study. Right? For your friend, right? Suppose that you're going to study. Right? Should your friend study or not study? And your friend is better off studying. And then if you don't study, should your friend study or not study? And again, your friend is better off studying. All right. So there's one Nash equilibrium of this game, which is that you both study. All right, and before sort of going back to the definition of a prisoner's dilemma, right, think very carefully about like what would happen, right? I have a curved exam, right? And you have GroupMe. What would happen, right? Or why don't you all just coordinate on not studying, right? You could all talk to each other. You could all say, hey, let's all not study for this midterm. We'll all do terribly, and Professor Liebman will just curve us up to an 80. Okay? What would you do in that case, right? If everyone on GroupMe was saying, we're all just not going to study, it's going to work out great, what would you do, right? And probably for a lot of you, you would still study because why should I trust that my friends are also not going to study, or just, you're the type of person who wants a good grade and so you're going to study, and them not studying is going to help you, right? So I think intuitively this makes sense, right, that you should still study with a curved exam like this, right? Now, looking at it though, right, there's a better outcome to be had, right? We could have had the outcome 80-80 rather than 70-70, right? So NS-NS is a better outcome, right? If you don't really care about learning, right? Because, right, you get the same grade, right? But no one had to study to do it, so you didn't have to pay that cost of studying, right? So this is a situation which arises naturally, right, where the world, assuming we don't care about like studying, I'm just giving you busy work, whatever, right? The world is a better place, right, if you could coordinate and not study. But because it's in your best interest and you're doing what's in your best interest, we produce basically a suboptimal outcome. All right. So this is just kind of a cute example, I think, that sort of hopefully you can relate to the fact that you would study and you would do what's in your best interest, while, in fact, if the whole class could coordinate on not studying, like the world, this is a bad example for this, but like, you could get to a better outcome that way. So let me give a little bit less of a less sort of contrived example, which is coming back to, I guess, the reason why we started coming up with game theory, and sort of the motivation behind the prisoner's dilemma wasn't actually anything about prisoners. It was originally developed during the Cold War, by the Rand Corporation, who cared a lot about sort of arms races and what was going on between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. Okay, so just to give, and again, the numbers here are going to be sort of wild because there's really not much you can say about like the disutility of nukes. I don't mean to like not be taking this seriously. I'm just trying to get sort of a point across. So we're going to have two players now, Soviet Union and the US, and both could either basically nuke the other side or not. Right? This is what we were worried about in the 1950s and 60s. And so again, these are not like numbers that make any sense, but just to put something here, let's say that if the world goes on and neither side nukes each other, right? That we all get a payoff of 5. And let's say if both sides nuke each other, let's say we get a payoff of like -5. Again, these numbers mean nothing. Just sort of they're really ordinal, not cardinal, maybe is the way to say this. So in the world where we destroy the world, both sides get -5. All right, and then let's say, and this is actually sort of important for the game to work this way, that like if you're like the USSR, right, and you're able to nuke the US and not get nuked back, right, that you get a little bit more, right, that you're the only one standing than you would. And, the US feels a little bit worse than if they also got sort of revenge, right? So there's some, satisfaction of being the world's superpower and some disutility beyond sort of the fact that we all die to being the loser of this arms race. And same in the other direction, all right? So maybe we have a payoff matrix that looks like this. So again, let's go through and let's find, right, the outcome of this game. So if you're the USSR, sorry, if you're the US and the USSR doesn't nuke, what should you do? Well, you should nuke, right? If you're the US and the USSR does nuke, what should you do? Well, you should also retaliate and nuke. And then the same thing, if you're the USSR and the US isn't gonna nuke, right? The US should nuke. Or sorry, the USSR should nuke, and same if the US doesn't nuke. All right, so again, right, we have one Nash equilibrium of this game, right? Both sides have an incentive to nuke the other. Is the Nash equilibrium of this game, right? And this is, again, the suboptimal outcome. Right, we'd all rather live in the world that we live in, right? We'd all rather be born, I guess, in a world where like both sides didn't nuke each other than the world in which they did, right? But both sides acting in their own best interest should do this, okay? So this is a horrifying result, right? This says that the way that this arms race is going to end, or the Cold War is going to end, is with mutually assured destruction, or with everybody dying. And so what this led to, right, and sort of understanding sort of the dynamics of this arm race, basically led to the idea of a mutually assured destruction, right? That if you're gonna nuke me, that I'm gonna nuke you, right? So the US flew B-52 bombers continuously, 24/7 around the world to make sure, right, that the situation where the USSR nuked, but the US didn't, right, and the US didn't retaliate, couldn't happen, right? We have planes in the air, and so if you drop a nuclear weapon on us, we'll retaliate. So we're getting rid of this possibility, all right? Same thing, the USSR allegedly had nuclear submarines all over the world, right, to take out the possibility that the US could nuke them without them retaliating, right? And what that does is it changes the game, right? So that there are only now two options, right? If I'm the US and I nuke, I know that the USSR is going to be able to respond. Or if I'm the USSR and I nuke, I know that the US is going to respond. And therefore, in both cases, it's in our best interest to not nuke, right? And so taking off these like off equilibrium choices, right, has completely changed the equilibrium, right? And so what we have, right, just to kind of formalize or to repeat the takeaway here, right? So first, right, a prisoner's dilemma, and I've already written this, right? Is a situation, right, where players acting in their best interest produce a suboptimal outcome. Right, so that's sort of takeaway one. But then, right, we can find ways around this, right, by changing the payoffs of other options, right? So in this case, we took off these other, the one side can nuke without the other retaliating, right, in order to change the outcome of the game. Right, so in this case, right, the US and USSR sort of had this strategy of mutually assured destruction, right, which made sure that we couldn't get these off the equilibrium path games. In the original example of like the mob and prisoners, the idea is that you have the mafia make sure that you kill like snitches, right, or kill people who who give who testify against them, because it's in their best interest to testify against, or you want to make it so it's not in their best interest to testify against the mob. And there are like lots and lots of examples of prisoners' dilemmas, right, throughout society. So one example that we have a lot is like polluting or climate change, right? There's some benefit to a lot of companies or people polluting, and there isn't that much benefit to like trying to stop as like a single person, right? But if everybody pollutes, right, then we get into this awful world in which there's just like a lot more pollution. And so you need something to sort of change that equilibrium more generally. Another example might be like advertising. So, you have Coke and Pepsi advertise against each other, right? Most likely, right, if both didn't advertise, people would buy just as much Coke and Pepsi. But because one is advertising, the other also has to advertise to make sure they're not the one that doesn't get any of the outcome. And so they just spend a whole bunch of money getting themselves to an outcome that they probably could have gotten themselves close to anyway if they didn't advertise. Another example is often like doping in sports. right? Whereas if your competitors are cheating, right, maybe you need to cheat as well. I'm not saying this is, ethical, but just saying that, this is sort of a fear that people have when it comes to, like, should we ban steroids, right? It's partly that it hurts the individual players themselves, but it also changes the equilibrium so that everyone to succeed feels like they need to use steroids, which isn't a good outcome. We're going to talk about the prisoner's dilemma in the case of oligopolistic competition. So, firms lowering their prices, right, to compete against each other, which in our case is probably a good thing for consumers. But it is the situation where, both firms would probably be better off not doing that. But that's a way in which a prisoner's dilemma actually helps the market, even though it hurts the players themselves. But these are situations, right, where because people are acting in their best interest and they're producing a suboptimal outcome, you need something else to kind of push the market into a better outcome. So I'm going to talk about something that comes up. I think is a natural question to ask, which is, can we have more than one Nash equilibria? And the answer is, yeah, we can. And what does that necessarily mean, or what does that tell us? So I'm going to start with the game that's in the notes called the pure coordination game. So let's say, and maybe the example that we give is driving on the left or the right side of the road, right? And if everybody wakes up in the morning and decides to drive on the left, let's say, just for the sake of it, there's a payoff of 2 for everybody, and if everybody decides to drive on the right, there's a payoff of 2. If one person decides to drive on the left and one on the right, both players get -2, right? That's a really dangerous situation because you have people driving towards each other, right? And same, if one decides to drive on the right and the other the left, okay? So in a pure coordination game, right, you want everybody driving, or which side of the road should we drive on game, right? You want everyone driving on the same side of the road. Everyone agrees that we should all drive, how we do. It doesn't matter, if everyone's driving on the left, like in the US, or on the right, like in England, right? It doesn't matter, right? It's just, you need one outcome, right? You don't want these other weird situations where people disagree on how to drive, okay? So going through, right, what's the best response? Well, if the other player, say, is going to play on the left, you want to play on the left, right? If the other player is going to play on the right, you want to play on the right. If player 1 is going to play left, player 2 should play left. Player 1 is going to play right, player 2 should play right. All right, so we have 2 Nash equilibria, all right? And this is a little bit tricky because now we don't have a great prediction of what's going to happen, right? Though we hope at some point, right, if the game got played enough that the parties would decide. But if just the first time I wake up and I have to decide which side of the road I want to drive on, right, that might be a problem for the first couple days until we all sort of figure out and how to coordinate. All right. So this isn't necessarily, this is sort of an abstract idea, but like there are a lot of situations where it helps to coordinate certain things, right? So things like USB technology, right, where everybody uses the same USB drive, allows us all to connect our computers to lots and lots of different software. But somebody had to come in and actually make that a common thing. So like phone chargers is not like that. We haven't all coordinated on phone chargers, and so like I can't use a Samsung charger to charge an iPhone, right? Or I can't, or vice versa, right? And so like in the Tate Center, there are those phone charger outlets, right, where you can charge your phone, but they need like 15 different cords because everyone has a different charger, and that was never coordinated on, right? The same way that like USB inputs were. Right, everyone listens to MP3 files or uses PDFs. Again, like there's some, those may not have been sort of done by an agency or a government, but at some point we sort of coordinated on that, and that gives us a better outcome than the world in which these things aren't coordinated and everyone is doing their own thing. Another, I guess, famous game of multiple equilibria is the game of chicken. So you may know this game, you may not, it's not. But it's a game where basically you get into, or at least in the telling here, into a car, and you drive towards the other person. So both people are in separate cars, and they drive towards each other, and they can each turn, right, or continue to go straight. And if they go straight, right, they're going to crash into each other, right, whereas one might turn out of the way at the last minute before the crash. And it's supposed to be a game that's like to show like how much, how brave you are, right? And so if you're the one who goes straight, right, while the other player veers, right, maybe you get a payoff of 10 to show that you're the braver one and the other one is quote unquote the chicken, right? If you both go straight though, you have a head-on accident and that's really bad, so let's give everyone negative 100. If you veer and the other player goes straight, you're the chicken, they get some glory. And if you both veer, well, you're both chickens, but at least you're not worse than your friend, right? And so again, in this game, right, suppose, let's find the best responses. So let's suppose that player 1 veers. What should player 2 do? Well, player 2 then should go straight, right? If player 2 goes straight, if player 1 is going to go straight, player 2 should veer, right? If player 2 is going to veer, player 1 should go straight. And if player 2 is going to go straight, player 1 should veer, right? Basically, we should never have a crash in equilibrium. So again, we have two Nash equilibria, go straight and veer, right? Or veer and go straight, right? But basically, we should never have a crash, but someone should always win, all right? And so this game comes up a lot in things like negotiations. Right, so right now, or a lot, like Congress is negotiating over another stimulus package, and there's disagreement about what to put into it, right? And often what you want to do in those situations is you want to try to commit to the fact that you're going to be the side that's going to go straight, so the other side has to veer, right? So like if you could like lock in your steering wheel so that you had to go straight, right? Then the other side knows that you have to go straight, and so you've taken off the possibility of veer for yourself, right? So then player 2 knows that they have to veer, right? And it's the same thing like with Congress, where they'll say, I am definitely going to do this, and I get my supporters behind it, so that it makes it so that it's harder for them to compromise, or harder for them to sort of go straight. Harder for them to veer. Which makes it so that the other side feels like they have to give something up. Again, though, these types of games, right, there isn't a clear, like, this should be the equilibrium of this game because there are multiple, right? Both sides could try to lock themselves in, and then you have a disaster, right, where, the negotiation just doesn't work out as planned. All right, so I want to talk pretty briefly about mixed strategies. So mixed strategy is a situation where a player might randomly pick, based on a set of probabilities, what actions to choose. So why might you do this? Well, sometimes it's better if your opponent doesn't know what you're going to do exactly, right? So let's say that let's use like a UGA football example, right? So maybe the team has a really good left tackle, right? And so they're very good at running left, okay? But if they were to run left every single time, right, the other team would just prepare for them to run left. And so sometimes they should run right, right? And so they might strategize and say, okay, 75% of the time we're going to run left, right? But in order to make it so that the other team can't focus on us running left, 25% of the time we'll run right to either keep them off balance, or maybe because they haven't focused on us running right, there's some advantage there, right? So sometimes you might not want to play, I'm going to run left every time, right? And so you mix by having some probabilistic reason or some probability of doing the other thing. All right. And the reason that this is important, or the reason I want to talk about it, is that in finite games, so games that have like a finite number of players and a finite number of actions, there always exists a mixed strategy Nash equilibrium. All right. Now it could be a pure strategy equilibrium, right? In the sense that we could mix 100% of the time I go left, right? Or 100% of the time I play top, right? But in the end of the day, there exists at least one. There could be multiple, like we saw in the last video. But this solves the problem that we ran into. This is, I guess, why Nash equilibria are so famous, right? It solves the problem that we ran into before, where like we often didn't have dominant strategy equilibria, right? And the idea of like iterated elimination of dominated strategies just didn't get us very far all of the time. Nash equilibria will exist, right? And it's a pretty minimal set of criteria to sort of narrow down situations where the game isn't stable, or strategically stable, I think is the term that I used. So really those are the two things that I want you to know about mixed strategies. One, just what a mixed strategy is. And then two, the reason that we use Nash equilibria is because in many types of games, right, Nash equilibria will exist, and that's a really powerful result. And yeah. So let me talk a little bit though about just a game with mixed strategy, just to give you a sense for like where this comes up, or where you've seen this. But again, you're not really responsible for this. But one type of game and a really common situation where mixed strategies come up are zero-sum games. So I win, you lose, or you win, I lose. The example that I'm going to give here, which I think is just kind of a fun example, is rock, paper, scissors. All right. And let me just steal the matrix here from the notes. Right. So we have in rock, paper, scissors. Right, so I think we've all played this game, right? If both sides play rock, no one wins. If you're player one and you play rock and the other side plays paper, you lose and the other side wins because paper beats rock. If they play scissors and you play rock, you win because rock beats scissors and they lose. Okay, and we can go through and we can solve out for this, this whole matrix. And we can even go through and we can see that there's no equilibria in pure strategies. All right, so if I think player two is going to play rock, as player one I should play paper, right? If I think that player two is going to play paper, if I'm player one I should play scissors. If I think that player two is going to play scissors, player one should play rock, right? And for player two, right, if I think that player one is going to play rock, I should play paper. If I think that player one is going to play paper, I should play scissors. And if I think that player one is going to play scissors, I should play rock. Okay, so we see very quickly, right, there's no Nash equilibria because there's no situation where anyone is playing a best response to the other's best response. At least in pure strategies, there's no Nash equilibria. All right, but if we think about, well, what should you do while playing rock, paper, scissors? Right, what you should do is you want to randomize, right? If you were going to play rock every single time, right, your opponent would exploit that and just play paper every single time. So it's not a best response, right? But what you can do is you can play each of them 30% of the time, or a third of the time, right? In which case, if your opponent wasn't doing that, right, they would be losing more on average, right? If they were playing paper half the time, right, they would be, you could exploit that. And so if you kept going, right? The thing that you should see, and if you sort of read through the notes on this, right, what you'll see is that there is a Nash equilibrium in this game, right? And the Nash equilibrium is that both sides basically randomize completely and play rock, paper, and scissors, each with 1/3 probability, right? And in that scenario, both sides get nothing, right? But that's, in a zero-sum game, that's the best that both sides can do, right? Because if one side is winning, then the other side isn't playing a best response, right? And so the best response to each other's best response, right, just necessitates that nobody gets anything, because otherwise the other side isn't playing a best response, and that's the Nash equilibrium. So a game that's complicated, like rock, paper, scissors, right, in some sense complicated, right, there's a Nash equilibrium for, and we can sort of predict the outcome, which is basically what you do when you play rock, paper, scissors. Like you've all intuited this solution.